The Yellow Wallpaper is the first-person narrative of a 19th century woman suffering from a mental breakdown after giving birth. In a secret diary, this narrator describes her setting as a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. This narrator is confined to a room with barred windows. It's possible that she's in an asylum, but the physical setting is less important than another landscape, the shifting consciousness of her mind. The narrator knows that she perceives reality differently from her husband, who is also her doctor. At first, she chalks this up to the expected difficulties of male-female relations. John, she writes, laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. This expectation of marriage is, of course, troubling in its own right, but there's an even darker side to their dynamic. John has almost complete control over his wife's body. The narrator's descriptions may be at times unreliable, but there are a few things we do know. She recently had a baby. She recognizes that she is sick. John belittles her, saying that she suffers from a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. Meanwhile, he prescribes her a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day of phosphates or phosphites, the narrator doesn't know which, and a regime of tonics and journeys and air and exercise. Also, John forbids his wife from writing, working, or socializing. And it quickly becomes clear that these so-called cures are exacerbating the narrator's condition, as she is left with very little to do except stare at the yellow wallpaper. And in her writing, she projects her mental disintegration onto the patterns that she sees on the walls. I never saw worse paper in my life, she writes, explaining that it contains one of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. Still, she finds this pattern compelling. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. Of course, this also describes the narrator's interior landscape, but it also describes the story, right? Like, initially, her narrative seems dull. I mean, plot summary, woman stares at wall. But then it becomes confusing. The wallpaper seems to be moving. We aren't sure where this narrator is or if we can trust her. And then something becomes pronounced enough to provoke our further study. Are these romantic descriptions of a house, a delicious garden, or its tattered decor? Are they intimate descriptions of a failing marriage, the desire for connection, or are they veiled suicidal musings? Or maybe they're attempts to find a meaning in an extremely limited experience, like Offred opening her hand in the sunlight in The Handmaid's Tale.